I'm Elijah, 33. I watched my own father toss the legal inheritance papers my grandfather left me into the fireplace while staring me dead in the eyes. The flames danced like he was erasing my future. Everyone gasped. I just smiled. Have you ever trusted the wrong person? Tell me in the comments. They thought I was broken, but what no one knew was that I had already seen this moment coming. My father had spent his life trying to outshine, outtalk, and outmaneuver my grandfather. And he hated how close Grandpa and I had become, how I reminded the old man of everything my father never was. So when Grandpa died and left behind a sealed envelope just for me, I knew my dad wouldn't handle it well. But I never expected him to burn it in front of the entire family before the lawyer even finished reading the will. What he didn't know, that envelope was just a decoy. The real documents were hidden where only I could find them. And that smile on my face, it wasn't forgiveness, it was the beginning of his undoing. Stay with me, because by the time I tell you how I turned the inheritance he tried to steal into the empire he lost, you'll understand why revenge is best served cold. Before we continue, if you haven't subscribed yet, join us now for more stories like this. The reading of the will took place on a rainy Thursday afternoon in my grandfather's old study. The air was thick with anticipation and barely concealed tension. The family had gathered like vultures, some already whispering guesses about who would get the house, the cars, the land. My father, James, stood near the window with a smug expression, arms crossed, pretending to look disinterested. But his eyes betrayed him, darting, calculating, hungry. He thought this day belonged to him. Grandpa had died 2 weeks prior, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 84. To most of the family, he was a stern, silent man who'd built his fortune through discipline and sheer force of will. But to me, he had been something more. He had been a mentor, a listener, and above all, someone who saw value in my dreams when others didn't. We spent hours in this very study discussing everything from architecture to legacy, and I knew without a doubt he had made preparations that day to protect what he believed in. The lawyer, a thin man with gray temples and a precise tone, began reading the formal document. There were expected allocations, trusts for cousins, a small house to an aunt, a scholarship fund in Grandma's name. Then he reached the part about me. To my grandson Elijah, he began, pausing to adjust his glasses. I leave my personal estate file, to be opened by him privately, containing documents, instructions, and properties not mentioned in this reading. The envelope was left in his care. At that moment, all eyes turned to me. I reached into my coat pocket, producing the sealed envelope. My hands were steady, but before I could even break the wax seal, my father stormed across the room. Without a word, he snatched the envelope from my fingers. The lawyer stood, protesting. My aunt gasped. But my father didn't flinch. He walked straight to the fireplace, tore the seal open, and with a dramatic flick of his wrist, tossed the contents into the flames. The crackle of fire drowned out every voice in the room. Ashes danced up the chimney like ghosts of what should have been my future. Then, silence. Everyone froze. The lawyer's face went pale. My mother stood up and called my father's name, but he ignored her. All eyes turned to me, waiting for an outburst, for a collapse, for anything. But I just stood there, calm. Then I smiled, not a vengeful smile, a knowing one, because what none of them realized, especially not my father, was that this had been predicted. The real documents were safe, and by burning that envelope, my father had just lit the match that would burn down everything he thought he owned. That was the moment I knew the game had begun. The room was still smoldering with shock when I quietly excused myself. No one tried to stop me. My father stood by the hearth like a triumphant executioner, convinced he had erased my claim from history. I didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. That would have meant the fire had consumed more than paper. It would have meant he'd won, but he hadn't, not even close. I stepped outside into the rain, letting the water hit my face and steady my breath. Every part of me wanted to turn back and scream the truth, to tell them that what he burned was worthless, that Grandpa had always been 10 steps ahead of him. But I knew better. This wasn't a moment to fight. It was a moment to remember. Let him believe he'd buried me alive. Let him celebrate while he still could. His downfall would be slower and far more public. 3 days before Grandpa died, he called me to his bedside. His hands were cold, but his mind was as sharp as ever. James thinks he'll outmaneuver me one last time, he whispered. Let him try, but you, Elijah, you're the one I trust. He reached under his pillow and handed me a leather keyring with one rusted key, 2 blank metal tags, and a small folded note. The paper was old, creased, and smelled faintly of cedar. On it, in his distinct, slanted handwriting, were 4 words: "Trust the attic drawer." That's where I went now. Back to the old farmhouse on the edge of Ridgewood Hill, where Grandpa had lived his last years. I used the key to open the back door, stepped through the familiar hallway, and climbed the narrow staircase that creaked under every step. The attic was dark, dust swirling through the beams like forgotten memories. I found the drawer beneath an unused writing desk, just as I remembered. Inside was a plain manila envelope, yellowed by time. But when I opened it, I nearly laughed. Title deeds, company shares, stock certificates, legal correspondence with a private trust in my name, and a notarized letter detailing Grandpa's intentions to bypass the main will entirely. Everything he truly valued, his legacy, his vision, was in this drawer, and it all had my name on it. That envelope my father burned? It had been a decoy, a test, really, and he'd failed it spectacularly. I sat back on the attic floor, holding those documents in my lap, the weight of them both literal and symbolic. My grandfather had handed me not just wealth, but the means to restore what my father had tarnished, and I wasn't going to waste it. He had lit the fire with his own arrogance. Now it was my turn to fan the flames. I stood, dusted myself off, and tucked the envelope into my coat. My smile returned, sharper this time. This wasn't just inheritance, it was strategy, the first real move on a chessboard he didn't even know he was standing on. Driving back from Ridgewood Hill, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in days: clarity. The storm that had hung over my thoughts since the will reading began to lift, replaced with resolve. My father thought he'd rewritten the script by burning those papers. What he didn't realize was that Grandpa had written a different ending altogether, one that placed me firmly in control. The documents were real, airtight, and notarized outside of the family's knowledge, and they were only the beginning. I parked 2 streets over from my apartment. Ever since Grandpa passed, I had been cautious, trusting no one. My father had always operated in shadows, half-truths, backroom deals, manipulation cloaked in charm. I wasn't naive enough to think he wouldn't have people watching me, especially now that he believed he had successfully erased my claim. That's why I never went home directly anymore. I used alleys, back entrances, and side streets like it was second nature. Revenge wasn't about rage, it was about patience. Once inside, I laid the documents across my kitchen table. The company shares had his signature and a transfer note dated 3 months before his death. The stock certificates were current. But it was the letter addressed to me that carried the real power. Grandpa hadn't just left me assets. He had left me instructions. A full breakdown of the companies he quietly acquired through shell corporations, all tied to a trust that named me the sole beneficiary. My father had always assumed he was the heir to the family empire, but in truth, Grandpa had quietly dismantled his access, one piece at a time. What made it more poetic was that my father hadn't noticed. He had spent the last 2 years bragging to family friends about his upcoming promotion to CEO of Grandfield Holdings. The smug dinner speeches, the flashy suits, the veiled insults he threw at me about being a dreamer, with no real direction, they all reeked of a man certain his throne was being polished. But the throne was hollow, and the crown, as it turned out, had never been his. The morning after the will reading, I made my first quiet move. I contacted the trust's lawyer, using the encrypted line listed in Grandpa's letter. The woman on the other end spoke with the precision of someone who had been waiting for my call. She confirmed everything. Grandpa had signed all documentation in the presence of witnesses. The trust was sealed, untouchable, and timed for activation on the date of the will reading. In other words, while my father was burning an envelope, the real transfer of power was already in motion. As I ended the call, I stared at the photograph on the shelf. Grandpa and me, side by side, years ago, after finishing the treehouse we built together. "Let him believe he's won," Grandpa had once told me. "That's when the real loss begins." And now, the first cracks were forming. The cracks didn't take long to spread. 3 days after I contacted the lawyer, my father called a family meeting at his estate. He didn't invite me, of course. I only found out because my cousin, who had never been good at keeping secrets, sent me a picture of the long dining table lined with familiar faces and expensive wine. My father sat at the head, wearing that smug, performative smile he always wore when trying to control the narrative. I could almost hear his voice through the photo pretending to reassure them that everything was in order, that the inheritance was being handled, that any confusion at the will reading was just a technical hiccup. What he didn't know, or maybe refused to believe, was that confusion had already turned into suspicion. Grandpa's legacy had stretched beyond the obvious. He wasn't just a wealthy man, he was a respected one. His absence left a silence that demanded clarity, and as days passed without official probate announcements or legal confirmations of the estate, people began to whisper. Old friends, board members, even the family's financial advisor. They wanted answers, and my father had none that wouldn't unravel the lie he was clinging to. Back in my apartment, I prepared the next step. I needed to move quietly but deliberately. One of the companies listed in Grandpa's envelope was a real estate investment firm, Gray Harbor Limited. According to the documents, it was fully owned by the trust now bearing my name. It also happened to hold the title to a block of commercial buildings downtown, one of which my father had leased for his private business office. He had no idea that overnight his landlord had changed. I didn't evict him. That would have been too loud, too soon. Instead, I sent a letter, formal, professional, anonymous, a rent reassessment notice, slight increase, nothing aggressive, just enough to rattle him, a nudge, the kind that whispers, "You're not as untouchable as you think." Meanwhile, the lawyer handling the trust sent out official notices to the financial institutions listed under the holdings. Bank accounts frozen, transfers reviewed, ownership flagged for audit, all legal, all silent. My father didn't hear a bang, he heard a hum, low, distant, but growing louder with each hour. The kind of sound you notice too late, just before the ground shifts beneath your feet. I watched it unfold from the shadows, the calls he made to old contacts, the abrupt meetings he scheduled, the way he barked at assistants, slammed car doors, and stayed late at the office pretending to be calm. My mother texted me that night asking if I was okay, that something felt off. I told her I was fine, and I was. For the first time in years, I was more than fine, because I wasn't chasing anything anymore. I was leading, quietly, precisely, and I knew exactly how to make a man like my father unravel by letting him do it himself. By the end of the week, the hum had grown into a tremor my father could no longer ignore. He paced his office like a man being hunted, even though he couldn't name the predator. He had always been so sure of his grip on everything, family, business, image. But this was different. The boardroom he once ruled with his booming voice now echoed with side glances and hushed conversations he couldn't control. It didn't help that he still had no idea I was the one orchestrating every shift in the air. That Friday, he showed up unannounced at my apartment. It was the first time he'd been there in years, not since the fight that made him call me a disappointment to his name. I opened the door slowly, already knowing why he had come. He stood in the hallway, drenched in sweat despite the cool air, clutching a folder that looked far too thin to hold any answers. "Elijah," he said, voice calm but hollow, like he was rehearsing being reasonable. "We need to talk." I let him in. Not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to see his face when he realized he was too late. He sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I had spread out Grandpa's documents nights earlier. He looked around the room, taking in the worn chairs, the books, the simplicity. It didn't fit his narrative of who I should be. Maybe that's what made him nervous. I offered him nothing. No drink, no smile, no words. He opened the folder and slid it across the table. Inside were printed screenshots of documents, trust records, legal notices with my name at the bottom. I had expected him to find them eventually, but it was the way he looked at me, like a man who finally realized the lion had been in the room all along, that made the silence between us feel heavier than ever. "So it's true," he said finally. "You're the beneficiary." I didn't answer. "You've had this planned since the beginning?" he asked, voice cracking slightly. "Even when I burned the envelope?" That made me smile just slightly. "That envelope was a test," I said, "and you failed." His jaw clenched. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Why would I tell the man who tried to erase me from my own legacy?" He stood then, his breath shallow, chest rising like a man trying to summon a fight he knew he couldn't win. "You think this is over?" he said. "No," I said quietly. I think it's just beginning." He left without another word, slamming the door behind him. I didn't move. I didn't need to, because for the first time in his life, my father had walked away not in triumph, but in defeat, and he knew it. That was the beauty of a quiet war. By the time your enemy realizes the game has changed, they're already 2 steps behind. He didn't show his face for days after that. The man who once walked through boardrooms like he owned oxygen now sent emails through assistants and avoided the firm's front entrance like a criminal dodging a spotlight. But while he sulked in the shadows, the rest of the world kept turning, and so did the gears I had put in motion. I wasn't chasing revenge anymore. I was administering justice, layer by careful layer, just as Grandpa had designed. The next shift came with a notice from Gray Harbor Limited, the real estate firm he still believed answered to anonymous offshore investors. The notice was simple. Effective immediately, the firm was terminating all existing lease agreements with subsidiaries of Grandfield Holdings pending a full structural audit. My father's private office was among the first to receive the letter. The eviction date? 2 weeks. No negotiations. The news spread like wildfire through his inner circle. Shareholders, once confident in his leadership, began making inquiries, some polite, others veiled threats wrapped in polite concern. They wanted to know what was happening behind closed doors, why accounts were frozen, why certain transactions were under scrutiny, why Elijah's name kept appearing in legal filings that had nothing to do with him before. My father, for once, had no answers that made sense. It didn't help that I had already met privately with the trust's investment director. She was sharp, methodical, and utterly loyal to my grandfather's original vision. She told me how Grandpa had spent his last years restructuring every corner of his empire, not for expansion, but for protection, not from the market, but from his own son. He knew your father's pride would destroy everything if left unchecked, she said, but he also knew you wouldn't make that same mistake. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't show up to any of the family's emergency dinners. But every morning, another domino fell. A canceled contract here, a paused merger there. Every financial maneuver my father had leveraged his reputation on was being dismantled, and not one headline had my name in it. That was the plan. Let him drown in silence. Let him guess how deep the water really was. One night, I walked past his now empty office building. The lights were off. The sign had already been removed. A delivery truck waited by the curb, loading boxes onto a dolly. I stood across the street, hands in my pockets, watching as the empire he thought was his began to vanish. It didn't give me joy, exactly, just closure. For all the years he mocked me for choosing humility over hunger, for thinking integrity was weakness, this moment wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, rising quietly, steadily, until there was no room left for lies. And as the truck pulled away into the night, I whispered to the dark street, "Grandpa, the pieces are in place. You were right. He never saw it coming." A week after the office was cleared out, my father's silence shattered. Not with words, but with action. He filed a petition to challenge the trust in court, claiming undue influence, mental instability, and manipulation in my grandfather's final days. It was a desperate move, and everyone knew it. The same man who stood at the will reading, burning documents with arrogance, was now painting himself as the victim. It was laughable, but it was also expected. The summons arrived in a crisp envelope, formal and smug, like he'd regained a sense of power by putting my name in legal print. I didn't panic. I forwarded the papers to the trust lawyer, who had already prepared for this exact scenario. She called me that evening, her tone calm, almost amused. "We'll handle it," she said. "Your father is walking into a room where every door locks behind him." The courtroom became our new stage. I didn't attend the first hearing, but I didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than either of us could. Video logs of Grandpa explaining his decisions, witnesses, doctors, notaries, and business associates affirming his clarity and intent. The trust's formation had been precise, legal, and deeply protected. There was no room for loopholes, no signatures to dispute. What my father called manipulation, the court saw as foresight. But what struck the hardest blow wasn't legal. It was emotional. A video played during one session, a personal message Grandpa had recorded months before his death. In it, he addressed me directly, but in open terms. "Elijah has always carried this family's quiet strength. Not the noise, not the title, but the heart. And when I'm gone, I want him to have what he needs. not just to survive, but to lead. The room fell silent. Even the judge looked away, as if giving the words space to land without interruption. That clip was picked up by a local business blog covering the case. Within 24 hours, it had gone viral. Suddenly, I wasn't just a name in court documents. I was the grandson of a man who had built an empire and passed it on, not to his son, but to the one who listened. Public sympathy shifted, quietly, powerfully. My father, once the commanding face of the Grandfield legacy, became a cautionary tale. A man who tried to burn his future and was now watching it rebuild itself without him. I received a call that night from a former associate of his. He offered me coffee, said he was reconsidering which Grandfield had the real vision. I smiled as I hung up. The shift had begun, not just in court, but in perception, and in a legacy war. That's where the true victory is won. It wasn't about proving him wrong anymore. It was about making sure everyone saw the truth for themselves. Let him fight in court. I was already winning in silence. One truth at a time, one witness at a time, one day at a time. By the second court session, my father stopped looking like the man I once feared. The suit still fit, the tie still matched, but there was something unraveling beneath the surface. An unease he couldn't hide anymore. The courtroom had become a mirror, reflecting back every corner he tried to keep hidden. The more he argued, the more it looked like desperation. And the more evidence we laid down, the clearer it became. He wasn't the victim. He was the architect of his own fall. But what he didn't expect, what none of them expected, was that I wasn't just sitting back and watching. While the legal team defended the trust, I was quietly rebuilding what he tried to destroy. Grandpa's letter hadn't only contained instructions on protecting assets, it had outlined something far more important: how to breathe life back into a legacy tainted by greed. His investments weren't just numbers, they were people, families, small businesses, land tied to memories and meaning. So I started reaching out to those people, one by one. The downtown commercial buildings he used to lease as trophies. I dropped the rent for longtime tenants. I restored the green space around the oldest structure my grandfather built, the same one my father once wanted to tear down for a parking lot. And then I did something he never would have done. I held a small open forum. No cameras, no press, just tenants, business owners, and partners. I told them the truth, that the face behind the trust had changed, that it wasn't about power anymore. It was about stewardship, and they listened. Some with hesitation, some with cautious hope. But by the end of that meeting, I could feel it, a shift not just in loyalty, but in spirit. That week, the story took on a new life. What had started as a scandal in the business pages began making its way into community features. Articles about renewal, headlines that read like something out of fiction. Grandson restores what father let die. A legacy reborn through quiet leadership. My name started appearing in boardroom discussions, not as the underdog, but as the next step. My grandfather hadn't just passed down wealth, he had passed down goodwill, and now I was holding it with both hands. At the next court hearing, my father avoided looking at me. He didn't speak unless asked. His lawyer did most of the talking, but the fire was gone. He wasn't fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for scraps. Scraps of control, scraps of pride. The same pride that made him burn that envelope without ever asking what was inside. When we exited the courthouse, reporters hovered nearby. They didn't crowd around him like they used to. Their cameras didn't follow his stride. Instead, they turned to me. And for the first time, I didn't look away. I gave them a small nod, nothing grand, just enough to say, I'm here now, and I'm not leaving. After that courthouse appearance, the story was no longer mine to push. It had taken on a rhythm of its own. Word of mouth outpaced court transcripts. Quiet meetings turned into invitations from legacy investors my father had alienated years ago. Some were skeptical, but most were curious. Curious about the grandson who didn't just inherit an empire but chose to rebuild it, brick by brick, without stepping on the backs of others to do it. I didn't chase the narrative. I let it unfold, the way my grandfather once told me truth always would. Slow, steady, undeniable. My father tried to reclaim attention the only way he knew how. He scheduled a public interview on a second-tier business channel, hoping to rewrite the narrative. He wore his usual armor, an expensive suit, rehearsed charm, and that voice people used to trust. But the moment the host asked him why his father bypassed him in the trust, there was a flicker, brief but telling. He couldn't answer it cleanly. Instead, he danced around the question with phrases like complicated family dynamics and unfortunate misunderstandings. The audience wasn't buying it. The comments flooded in before the segment even ended. He's deflecting. The son is more grounded. This explains everything. That interview did more damage than any courtroom evidence ever could. It wasn't about contracts or signatures. It was about integrity, and the public could feel what he lacked. He had spent his life mastering appearances, but appearances were brittle. And now the cracks were visible. A few nights later, I returned to the farmhouse at Ridgewood Hill. I hadn't been back since recovering the documents from the attic, but something in me needed to walk those creaking floors again. The house felt quiet, but not empty, the kind of quiet that holds memory rather than absence. I sat in my grandfather's old chair by the fireplace, the same one my father had once refused to sit in because it made his back hurt. Funny how comfort had always meant more to him than legacy. I reached into the drawer where the original envelope had been and found something else tucked beneath the lining. Another letter, this one sealed and simply marked, "For when the truth rises." My hands trembled as I opened it. The message was short. "Elijah, if you're reading this, you didn't just survive, you stood, and that's all I ever hoped for. Let the man you become be louder than the empire they tried to steal." I sat there in silence, letter pressed to my chest, the flames from the hearth dancing just like they had on the day my father thought he'd burned my future. He thought fire was an end, but it had only marked a beginning, my beginning. Outside, the wind rustled the old oak tree where I'd once buried a time capsule with Grandpa. And for the first time since his death, I felt him close, not as a memory, but as a presence in everything I was becoming. The next morning, I stood beneath the oak tree where the time capsule lay buried. I hadn't touched it since the day we buried it, Grandpa and I, just before my 15th birthday. I remembered how he smiled when we lowered the rusted tin box into the soil, sealing it with a quiet nod like it was more than just childhood memorabilia. "One day," he'd whispered, "this will mean something." Back then, I thought it was just one of his sentimental lessons, but now, after reading his final letter in the study, I understood. That box held more than memories. It held intention. I dug carefully through the soft earth, my fingers wet with dew and history. When I finally lifted the box, it was heavier than I remembered. Inside were small, ordinary things at first glance. A photo of us on the treehouse, a dog tag from his military days, an old map of the farm. But under the bottom panel, taped carefully and wrapped in faded cloth, was something I never knew existed. A signed letter from the founding partners of Grandfield Holdings dated 40 years ago. It confirmed Grandpa as the sole shareholder at inception, with a clause stating he held the legal right to reassign the company to a beneficiary outside the family line if necessary. I stared at the signature. It wasn't just a legal artifact, it was the final nail. With this, any court challenge would collapse. My father had argued that the trust was an emotional whim made in Grandpa's last days. But this document proved it wasn't whim, it was strategy, decades in the making, and I was holding it in my hands. I called the lawyer immediately. She didn't speak for a full 10 seconds after I described what I'd found. Then she said, "This changes everything." The document was authenticated within 48 hours. It was ironclad, original ink, proper witnesses. There was no argument left. The trust stood unshakable, and now so did my role in it. The court issued its final ruling 3 days later. The challenge was dismissed with prejudice. My father was barred from appealing. His remaining stake in Grandfield Holdings, already frozen, was officially transferred. He was out. But when the ruling came down, I didn't celebrate. There were no toasts or grand announcements. I walked to the rooftop of my apartment building that night and watched the city lights flicker below. Somewhere across town, my father was learning what it meant to lose not just a company, but the illusion of power. And somewhere deeper in the quiet, I imagined Grandpa standing beside me, watching it all unfold like he had seen it long before I ever did. That's when I realized something. This wasn't just about inheritance or revenge, it was about legacy, the kind you don't steal or burn but earn. And in that moment, I knew exactly what to do with everything he left me. I wasn't going to rebuild my father's empire, I was going to build something better. The announcement came quietly, just how I wanted it. A simple press release sent to all former stakeholders and media outlets who had once chased the story like vultures. It read, "Effective immediately, Grandfield Holdings will be restructured under new leadership. The company will operate under a new name and direction, one that reflects the values of its original founder: integrity, sustainability, and generational impact." There was no mention of my father, no public dismissal or gloating, just a shift, a clean break from what had been poisoned. I renamed it Eldon Core. Eldon for the old strength Grandpa used to talk about, the kind that isn't loud but never breaks. Core because that's where the real legacy always lived, not in titles or buildings but in values. The rebrand wasn't cosmetic, it was fundamental. I gutted the board, retaining only the few who had aligned with Grandpa's vision. I canceled deals my father had made out of greed. I hired younger, hungrier minds, some from families my father had once looked down on, and I opened community grant programs in Grandpa's name, targeting the neighborhoods he grew up in and never forgot. The reaction was immediate. Some praised the vision, others called it naive, but I didn't flinch. For once, I wasn't walking in someone else's shadow. This wasn't my father's story anymore. It was mine. I even brought Grandpa's old desk into my new office, the one with the uneven drawer and scratched surface, the one my father always refused to use because it wasn't executive enough. I sat at that desk every morning, and with each passing day, the pressure that used to haunt me began to fade. I hadn't spoken to my father since the court ruling. He didn't reach out. I didn't expect him to. But late one evening, a package arrived at my door with no return address. Inside was the watch Grandpa always wore, silver, dented, and ticking faintly. I stared at it for a long time. It had vanished after the funeral. I assumed my father had taken it out of spite or sentiment, I wasn't sure which. But now it was here, silent and heavy in my palm. No note, just the watch. And for the first time since all this began, I felt something close to grief. Not for what was lost, but for what never was. Maybe that was his way of surrendering, or apologizing, or maybe it was just an ending. I placed the watch on the desk beside the letter Grandpa had left me. 2 relics, one of time, one of truth. And just like that, I understood something I hadn't before. Revenge hadn't brought me peace. Power hadn't healed the wound. It was something simpler. The quiet knowledge that I had honored the man who saw me when no one else did, that I had protected what mattered, and in doing so, I had become the kind of man Grandpa always believed I could be. In the weeks that followed, Eldon Core began to take shape. The name was whispered through boardrooms and startup circles with equal curiosity. Some saw it as a phoenix, others a gamble, but what none of them realized was that I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was building a sanctuary for something rare in business, legacy with heart. Every policy I implemented, every investment we approved, came back to one question: would Grandpa have been proud? That compass, silent but firm, kept me steady through the turbulence of transition. I spent mornings in the office and evenings walking the Ridgewood Hill property. I hadn't put it up for sale, though I could have made a fortune from developers. Instead, I restored it, not for profit, but for purpose. The farmhouse became a leadership retreat for young entrepreneurs from overlooked backgrounds. The barn was converted into a solar-powered learning center. I left the attic untouched. It remained a private space, still holding the echo of the day I found the envelope that changed everything. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the hills, casting gold across the field, I saw a car pull up the old gravel drive. I knew the silhouette before the door even opened. My father stepped out, dressed casually, no briefcase, no shield. For a long moment, we just looked at each other across the yard. There was no courtroom, no witnesses, just the raw space between a father and son shaped by the same man but pulled in opposite directions. He didn't speak at first, just walked slowly toward me, the crunch of gravel beneath his shoes louder than any words. When he finally stopped, he nodded toward the house. "You kept it," he said. "I did," I answered. He looked around as if seeing it for the first time, not as property, but as memory. He always loved this place more than anything, he muttered, even more than the company. That's why I kept it, I said, softer now. We stood in silence, the kind that only exists between people with too much history and too little closure. Then he reached into his pocket and held something out, a photograph. It was old, worn around the edges, Grandpa, my father, and me as a toddler sitting on the porch steps. I took it carefully, surprised by the emotion that flickered in my chest. I found it when I was cleaning out my office, he said. Thought you should have it. I nodded. No thank you. No resentment. Just acknowledgement. He turned to leave but paused. You did more than I ever could, he said quietly. And you did it better. Then he walked away, not defeated, but smaller. Not because I'd beaten him, but because the weight of what he had lost finally caught up to him. As I stood there beneath the tree, photograph in hand, I realized I didn't need him to understand everything. I just needed to know I hadn't become him, and I hadn't. After he left, I stood alone in the yard for a long time, holding the photo in my hand. The porch steps behind me hadn't changed much since that picture was taken. The wood still creaked, the paint still peeled where Grandpa refused to replace it, saying that a little imperfection made things real. I traced the outline of our faces in the image, Grandpa's steady smile, my father's forced one, my toddler grin completely unaware of what time would eventually pull apart. It wasn't just a picture, it was proof that once, before the silence and the pride, we were just a family, or something close to it. I framed the photo and placed it on the desk in the study, right next to Grandpa's letter and the silver watch. It didn't feel like closure. It felt like the middle of something, an unspoken understanding that time doesn't heal everything, but it does clarify what really matters. My father hadn't asked for forgiveness, and I hadn't offered it, but his visit was the closest we'd ever come to a truce, even if it was quiet and unfinished. The next morning, I returned to the city. Eldon Core had officially begun its community venture series, and our first major project was launching in a neighborhood my father had once written off as a bad investment zone. But Grandpa used to tell me, you don't build where it's already perfect. You build where people have given up and need a reason to hope again. That was the spirit of this new chapter. We were breaking ground on a revitalization effort, a multi-purpose center designed to give young creatives a space to grow, pitch, learn, and build. Not for profit, for legacy. I stood with the team as we unveiled the plans. Reporters snapped photos, community leaders gave speeches, but when they asked me to speak, I didn't give a corporate message. I told them about the treehouse, the attic drawer, the envelope that was meant to be burned. I told them about my grandfather's belief that impact wasn't measured in money, but in how long your name stays alive in stories told by people you've never met. That night, as the crew packed up and the event faded into memory, I got a text from my cousin. It was a photo of my father sitting alone on a bench outside the courthouse, the same one where he had once walked out like a king. No press, no entourage, just him and the evening light. I stared at the image for a long time. He looked tired, not just old, but hollow in the way people get when their illusions have finally crumbled. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Some stories finish not with confrontation, but with absence. And this story, the one that began with flames and silence, was now finding its ending in something far quieter. Not revenge, not victory, but peace. A peace only earned when you choose to build, even after someone tried to burn it all down. 2 months later, the center was finished. It stood in the middle of a once-forgotten block, now painted with murals that told stories of resilience, struggle, and revival. Inside, walls were lined with books, workspaces, and open-air studios for young creators who had never before been given a platform. Every room pulsed with energy, the kind you don't find in boardrooms or luxury high-rises, but in places where people finally feel seen. We named it the Eldon House, a nod not to power, but to roots. I walked through it slowly the morning before the grand opening, touching the corners, breathing in the fresh paint and new purpose. It was exactly what Grandpa would have wanted, not a monument to him, but a vessel for others. As I reached the back hallway, I found a young woman adjusting a canvas on the wall. She turned and smiled, a little shy but curious. "You're the guy who built this place, right?" she asked. I shrugged. "Sort of. Someone else gave me the idea. I just followed it." She laughed and went back to straightening the frame. I stood there for a moment, realizing something deeper. Legacy isn't something you hold, it's something you pass. And it only lives as long as someone else decides it's worth carrying. That afternoon, the ribbon cutting brought out a crowd larger than we expected. City officials, old business rivals, journalists, but most importantly, families and kids from the neighborhood who had never had a space like this before. I watched from the side as a group of teenagers stepped onto the stage and performed an original spoken word piece about rebuilding what's broken. Their words hit like truth should, unpolished, raw, and sacred. Later, while shaking hands and posing for photos, I noticed a familiar figure lingering near the back. My father. He didn't come forward, didn't speak, just stood in the shade, watching. I didn't walk toward him, and he didn't make a move either. We both understood something unspoken. This was never a story that ended with an apology. His chapter had closed, quietly. Mine had opened, loudly. And somewhere in that balance, we had both found our place. That night, after everyone left, I walked the halls of the Eldon house alone. The lights dimmed, the echoes of the day still humming in the walls. I paused at a small plaque mounted near the entrance. It read, "Dedicated to those who build in silence, love in truth, and rise when others try to bury them." I hadn't written the words, but someone on the team had captured the essence perfectly. I stepped outside into the night. The city was alive but calm. I looked up at the stars, the same sky that watched my grandfather teach me how to dream beneath the treehouse beams. He was gone. But everything he stood for now had a home, not in papers or courtrooms, but in brick, breath, and belief. A week after the opening, I received a letter, not an email or a text, but a handwritten envelope slid beneath the office door at Eldon House. The handwriting was familiar, sharp, but slightly uneven. It was my father's. I hesitated before opening it, the weight of everything that had passed between us pressing down on my chest. There had been no apologies, no attempts at mending what had broken, just that silent moment at the launch, and now this. Inside was a single page. No greeting, no sign-off, just one line in his ink. "I couldn't build what you did. I tried to control what I didn't understand. You were always his true heir." I read it 3 times, not looking for hidden meaning, but letting each word settle in me. It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense, but it was the closest he could get. And somehow that made it heavier. He wasn't trying to rewrite the past. He was just surrendering to what had always been true. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside Grandpa's watch. That drawer had become a kind of resting place for pieces of our history, not for display, but for remembrance. A timeline written not in headlines or wealth, but in small moments where truth finally made itself known. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I had already said everything through what I built. This place was my answer. These walls, this mission, my voice. That same afternoon, a local journalist visited Eldon House for a follow-up feature. She walked through the halls slowly, taking notes, occasionally asking questions. But it wasn't until we sat down in the courtyard that she asked what none of the other reporters had dared to. "What kept you going after the will reading? After everything your father did?" I didn't answer right away. I looked out at the children painting a mural in the distance. I listened to the sound of laughter and footsteps echoing through the open-air classrooms. Then I said, "He burned the envelope, not the legacy. He tried to destroy a document. What he didn't understand was that the real inheritance wasn't in paper, it was in principle." She nodded, scribbled something down, and then asked if I had ever considered expanding Eldon House beyond the city. "Maybe," I said. "But not for scale, only if the heart of it stays intact." Because that was the lesson Grandpa taught me in every action, in every quiet moment of mentorship. Power without integrity is a hollow throne, and building something meaningful requires more than blueprints, it requires belief. That night, I sat under the tree at Ridgewood Hill, the same spot where the time capsule once lay. The wind was soft, The stars were scattered across the sky like old whispers. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was standing in someone else's shadow. I felt whole. I felt home. 2 days later, I received a call from my cousin, the same one who had sent me that photo of my father sitting alone outside the courthouse. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Uncle James isn't doing well," she said. "He's been quiet, different. He asked about you." I didn't know how to respond to that. It had been weeks since our last encounter, that brief, wordless moment in the shadows of Eldon House. He had disappeared again, not with bitterness this time, but with something closer to retreat, maybe even shame. And now he was asking about me as if something inside him had finally shifted. I told her I'd think about visiting, but that night I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, the old photograph of the three of us, Grandpa, my father, and me, still resting on the nightstand beside the letter and the watch. Forgiveness isn't always a moment. Sometimes it's a slow return to softness. Not forgetting, but releasing. I wasn't sure if I was there yet, but something inside me was ready to try. The next morning, I drove to the care facility on the edge of town. It wasn't a hospital, just a quiet place where people went when the noise became too much. My father was in the garden, alone, seated beneath a tree, not unlike the one at Ridgewood Hill. He looked smaller than I remembered, not just older, but like time had finally peeled away the pride. When he saw me, he didn't rise or speak. He just offered the seat beside him with a slight nod. I sat without saying a word. For a while, we just watched the wind stir the leaves. Then he cleared his throat and said, "I built towers. You built roots. I see that now." His voice was thinner, rougher than I remembered, but the weight in his words landed fully. I didn't answer. Not out of anger, but because some truths don't need to be echoed, they just need to breathe. He reached into his coat pocket and handed me a worn journal. "It was your grandfather's," he said. "He wrote in it more than I ever realized. After he passed, I found it in the safe, but I couldn't read it, not then." I turned the pages slowly. It was full of sketches, notes, reflections, pieces of a man I knew intimately, but had never seen quite like this. His dreams, his fears, his thoughts on family, on me. "I think he knew this moment would come," my father said. "He always saw further than both of us." I nodded, clutching the journal gently. He did. We didn't talk much more after that, but as I stood to leave, he looked up at me with eyes that no longer held the need to win. "Thank you," he said, and this time I answered, "You're welcome." Not because he deserved it, but because I did. Because healing doesn't always come wrapped in justice. Sometimes it comes quietly, when you finally let go. I brought the journal back with me to Ridgewood Hill that evening. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a soft orange glow across the fields. I sat on the porch steps, the same ones in the old photograph, and opened the journal slowly. Each page felt like a doorway. Grandpa's handwriting flowed in looping ink, sometimes sharp, sometimes fading at the corners. The early pages were filled with ideas for the company notes on ethics, on community, on how to measure success not by profit margins, but by the number of lives improved. But the further I read, the more personal it became. There were entries about me, observations from when I was a child, short reflections on our time together in the attic or working on the treehouse or just walking along the fence line in silence. One entry caught my breath. He had written, "Elijah listens with his eyes. He absorbs the world before reacting to it. That's why I trust him. He leads by feeling, not by force." I closed the book and pressed it against my chest, the weight of it filling a space I hadn't even realized was still empty. Over the next few days, I began transcribing portions of the journal into a digital archive. Not to publish, not yet, but to preserve. These weren't just his thoughts, they were blueprints for something more enduring than brick and steel. A philosophy, a way of living and building that could outlast even our family name. Eldon Core was no longer just a company, it had become a reflection of those pages. Every policy, every decision now passed through the filter of what he wrote when no one else was watching. One morning, while reviewing a section he wrote about redemption, I paused. It said, "Forgiveness is the slow replanting of a field you once let die. It won't grow overnight. But if you water it, even with just a little grace each day, it returns." That was when I knew what I had to do next. I returned to the care facility with a copy of the journal. My father was in the same garden chair beneath the same tree. This time I didn't wait for him to speak. I handed him the copy. "He wanted you to read this too," I said. He took it without a word, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the cover. I didn't stay long. I didn't need to. Healing wasn't about forcing moments, it was about leaving space for them to take root on their own. Driving away, I felt something settle inside me, a kind of peace that wasn't dramatic or loud, just steady. Grandpa had left us both the same gift, a roadmap, one that didn't point to wealth or revenge, but to restoration. And somehow, in all the ruin, something beautiful had been rebuilt. Not just a company, not just a reputation, but a family, fragile, flawed, and finally learning how to begin again. Autumn came slowly to Ridgewood Hill. The leaves turned gold and crimson, the air thinned with each passing day, and the sky took on that pale blue hue Grandpa used to call memory weather. I found myself spending more time at the farmhouse again, drawn by a quiet that no longer felt heavy. I'd sit on the porch in the evenings with the journal, reading and rereading his words, letting them settle in the places where grief used to live. Each entry seemed to take on new meaning, now that time had dulled the edges of everything that once felt sharp. My father had started writing back. Small notes, never long, never dramatic, just handwritten pages slipped into my mailbox at Eldon House. He didn't sign them, but I always knew they were his. One read, "I used to think building meant controlling. You taught me it meant trusting." Another simply said, "I miss the sound of your grandfather's laugh." I didn't respond directly. I didn't have to. Each day that passed in silence between us now felt less like avoidance and more like understanding. Some relationships, I realized, don't need full repair, just acknowledgement that something new is being built in place of what was lost. Eldon Core had begun expanding quietly, not for acclaim, but by invitation. Cities with fractured communities reached out. Local leaders who had once rolled their eyes at legacy building asked how to replicate the model. I sent blueprints and principles, not franchises. The mission wasn't to create clones, it was to help others find their own roots. The more we grew, the more I understood what Grandpa had meant when he said legacy isn't held, it's handed off. Each center we opened was a hand extended to someone who had been overlooked. That was the inheritance that mattered. One crisp morning, while walking the trail behind the farmhouse, I stopped at the old oak tree, the one where we buried the time capsule, where I dug up the truth, where so many of my memories now circled like birds returning to familiar branches. I leaned against the bark and looked up, the branches arching above like arms holding the sky. There was no ceremony, no crowd, no final words, but I pulled from my coat something new, a letter I'd written, one addressed not to my father or to the world, but to Grandpa. I folded it neatly and buried it beneath the roots where the capsule once lay. A full circle, not to revisit the past, but to return a piece of myself to the soil that shaped me. In that moment, I wasn't the boy with everything taken from him. I wasn't the man who outmaneuvered a legacy of pride. I was just a grandson, saying thank you in the only language that mattered now, quiet and complete. As I walked back toward the farmhouse, the wind moved through the fields like a whisper. And I finally understood. The fire didn't end the story. It lit the way to something better. In the end, the man who once stood at the fireplace burning what he believed was my future, watched as I built something that couldn't be reduced to ash. The power he tried to seize with destruction was quietly returned in full, but not through revenge. Through restoration, through legacy, through choosing to build instead of burn. That was the true reversal. He thought he had ended a chapter, but I was just beginning to write the story my grandfather had always seen in me. Eldon Core now thrives in 6 cities, with over 40,000 lives impacted through community programs, mentorship, and restored neighborhoods. Business journals call it a new blueprint for legacy-led leadership. Community members simply call it home. And when people ask how it all started, I don't mention lawsuits or courtrooms. I tell them about a boy, a treehouse, and a man who planted something deeper than money. Let this be your reminder. When people try to destroy what's yours, smile. Not because you're weak, but because you know something they don't. Legacy isn't built in boardrooms. It's buried in roots, waiting for someone strong enough to dig. And when you finally rise, let them feel the difference, quiet and undeniable. Thanks for spending time with this story. If it resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Someone else may need to hear it too. Watch another real-life journey by clicking on the left and subscribe so you never miss what comes next.